All right. So let me just get all my things together here. There we go. So thank you so much for having me. I was just about to ask where in Norway we were, but well, Oslo user group, that kind of gave it away, I guess. So this talk is kind of made from partly from the perspective of running Blazor in production, but also helping developers on forums and stuff like that, Reddit and things like that. So hopefully it will answer some of your questions during this evening, I guess. So Blazor, some people love it. Some people haven't tried it yet. Now, this is a joke, of course, but how many of you are using Blazor today? Hand up. Oh, almost half of you. How many wants to use Blazor? Hopefully the same amount at least. So how many of you are a little bit unsure about Blazor? Okay. Awesome. So hopefully I will get to answer some of those questions. My name is Jimmy Engström. I work for a company called CAD Group in Sweden. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP for over 10 years now. And I've been running Blazor in production since its release in 2019, in one way or another. I'm the co-host of a podcast and Twitch stream and YouTube channel, all of the above, and a user group as well, called Coding After Work. So please check that out if you want to learn more. We are building a call for paper site in Blazor using RavenDB and Blazor. I think we're running server right now, and we're going to do all this good .NET 8 stuff. Right now, we actually just moved. So this is my temporary studio that you see behind me. But we are building a new one with a nice green screen and stuff like that. So I have written a book on Blazor. One became two, and I'm actually working on the third edition of this book. And these are the only Blazor books that has raccoons on the cover, which is important, of course. But enough about me. Let's talk about Blazor. I want to start kind of talking about Blazor, how it works, before we get into running it in production, because I think it's important to understand all the different things in Blazor before we go into how to run it in production, or the tips and tricks, basically. So at NDC Oslo back in 2017, Steve Sanderson had a talk. Did anyone see that talk? Oh, a couple of you. Awesome. So the talk was called Web Apps Can't Really Do That, Can They? Spoilers, they can. So Steve thought, wouldn't it be kind of cool to be able to run C# inside of the browser? So we took an open source project and compiled that to WebAssembly. So when an open source, I should say, C# runtime. So when it takes the stage, you got a working demo of C# running inside of the browser. He had a working IntelliSense, and he even had the name Blazor, which I think is pretty cool that that name survived for so long. So why is Blazor awesome? Well, I saw a post on Reddit that embodied it very well. It feels like cheating. It feels like I'm getting away with something, and it shouldn't be this easy to run or build sites. And this is exactly how I feel. Now, me included, I'm not very comfortable with running JavaScript or TypeScript. But with Blazor, I don't have to switch between JavaScript or TypeScript. I don't have to install another framework. There's no extra skills involved, no React, no Angular that I have to learn. I'm participating in a course right now at work, trying to learn Angular. And right off the bat, we're talking about, yeah, we need to we have to have Node.js, we have to have NPM, and all of these things that just, my brain just went overboard on or overloaded. I think that Blazor removes a lot of these pain points. So at my former workplace, we were working with another company, and this was a conversation a colleague of mine had. So the other company has said, well, I just made a quick site in Blazor. And my colleague said, oh, this is exciting. So why did you use Blazor? What do you think about Blazor? We've been using Blazor since 2019. Let's bond over Blazor. And he, are you using Blazor? And the guy said, no, we're not using Blazor. I'm a React developer. My colleague went, so why did you use Blazor for this then? Well, I just needed to do something very, very quickly, and I needed to get this working fast. So in this case, even a seasoned React developer chooses Blazor before React in this case, because they needed to do something fast. They needed to make something fast, which is super interesting, I think. I read somewhere that Blazor is for developers that don't want to learn new things. And that is definitely not the case with me. I love learning new things, but it can also be a little bit overwhelming, because there is a saying, misfortune never comes alone. And for me, that's NPM, Webpack, TypeScript, JavaScript, Node.js, Bower, Angular, React. Well, the list is very long. So learning web technologies now is going to be a giant uphill battle. But for Blazor, it removes most of the clutter, most of the things that I have to learn. I can focus on one language, one workflow. And that's Blazor for me. I had this slide at NDC London, and there was a fellow speaker taking a picture of this. And oh boy, the Twitter or X really, they don't have a sense of humor. So there was a lot of people like, oh, we lost, NDC should not put these kinds of things on stage. And well, the point here, which I will come to, is well, it's not the Angular killer. I was contacted by someone on Facebook, and he said, are you working with Blazor? And yes, I am. Never gonna be a thing. Actually, I don't know if he had his arm crossed, but it felt like that at this point. So why don't you think it's gonna be a thing? Never gonna beat Angular or React. And that's not the point. The point is not to kill another framework, not to replace another framework. I mean, there can be more than one. This isn't Highlander. This is more about giving C# developers a way to create interactive web applications. So Blazor is WebAssembly. This is a very common thing that people say when it comes to Blazor. 2 years ago, we had Steve Sanderson on our podcast, and I asked him, because I don't know what you're working with, but I see a lot of developers are using Blazor Server. So I asked him, do you see the same kind of trends that I'm seeing? Most of the developers I talk to are using Server. And he said, yeah, Microsoft is seeing the same trend. Now, WebAssembly is gaining fast, and I imagine with .NET 8, it's gaining even faster. And Blazor Server was the first version out there, so that might be a little bit, might skew the information a bit. I also talked to my friends over at Progress Telerik, and they're seeing the same thing. Most users are running Blazor Server at this point. So I think it's kind of important that we need to talk about the other platforms as well. Blazor is so much more than just WebAssembly. And if we look at blog posts or talks like these or books or whatever it may be, there is a very heavy WebAssembly focus. So I want to bring that back. I want to focus on all the platforms so that we know when should we pick what. Let's do that. Let's talk about the different platforms. So there are basically 3 different ways of running Blazor. We got Blazor Server, we got Blazor WebAssembly, and we have Blazor Hybrid. The only real difference between these different frameworks or hosting models is the things that we have access to. If you're running Blazor Server, we have access to server resources. So we can access the database, we can access the server's memory or CPU. If you're running WebAssembly, we're going to need to have an API between the server and the database, for example. Or the client and the database, I should say. But we do have access to client resources, so the client's memory. And with Hybrid, we have access to the local resources, not from a web browser, but actual direct connection, like, for example, turning on and off the light on a phone or something like that. But let's start with Blazor Server so that we know how Blazor Server works. So it all starts with Razor components running on the server. Then we have Blazor kind of wrapping that Razor component. It creates a render tree with some information. In this case, an H1 tag, Blazor rules, and a button says click me. Then we have the browser. And on the browser, we have a DOM, in this case empty, and a little piece of JavaScript that is responsible to connect to the server with SignalR when we're talking about the server, Blazor server. So it's going to connect SignalR, it's going to get the data over to the JavaScript, and then the JavaScript is updating the DOM. Awesome. So let's say that I click the button. The button event is going to go over to the JavaScript, over SignalR, and the Razor component is going to have some kind of code that it wants to run. It's going to run that code, and in this case, a very subtle change. We changed Blazor rules with a Z to an S instead. Since it knows what it has sent over previously, it knows that, well, this change is not on the client yet. So it's going to push over only that change over to the JavaScript and then update the DOM. This is a little bit of a misrepresentation because it's not going to push the H1 tag. It's just going to push over an ID and stuff like that. So the payload is going to be way smaller. What about WebAssembly? Well, first we need to understand what WebAssembly or JavaScript, how JavaScript works. So when we execute JavaScript, we get some JavaScript, it gets parsed, it gets compiled, and then the JIT interpreter is going to run the code. With WebAssembly, we can bypass some of these steps and simply run WebAssembly right there in the JIT interpreter. So per definition, it should be faster than running JavaScript. I don't have any actual numbers, but from what I'm hearing, WebAssembly is faster. So what Microsoft did was that they took the Mono runtime, compiled that to .NET.wasm. And here's the really cool part. It's running the same DLLs as the server app did. Same exact DLLs. So when I heard this the first time, I was a little bit nauseous because, wait a minute, it's running the .NET runtime inside of the web browser, and it's running .NET inside of the web browser. Then I got to thinking it's actually running .NET inside of the web browser, which is kind of cool if you think about it. So what we also can do in, I believe it was in .NET 6, is that we can ahead of time compile. So what happens is that it's going to remove the DLLs and simply put all the DLLs, all the things that I need inside of the WebAssembly download. So it's going to compile our .NET DLLs to WebAssembly. The problem here is that the .NET or the WebAssembly that we can download is going to get a whole lot larger. Now we're going to come back to payload in a bit, but that might be a problem for some scenarios. So that's how, let's go back to the Blazor server example. So this is how Blazor server worked. We had the Razor components, we had Blazor, we had the render tree, small signal R, talking to JavaScript, updating the DOM. The only difference when it comes to WebAssembly is really where this is running. Suddenly we have everything running inside of the browser. It's running inside of the .NET WebAssembly. We have the same Razor component. We still have Blazor. We still have the render tree. WebAssembly can't update the DOM directly, which means that we need some kind of small JavaScript interop to update the DOM. So we still have some kind of interop. In this case, it's direct JavaScript interrupts. So it's updating the DOM that way. In .NET 8, we got some new things, and we're going to talk about those as well. We got static server-side rendering. So SSR, we got static SSR and streaming SSR, which is kind of cool. And we're going to go into what that actually means for us developers. We also got a per component render mode and an auto render mode. I'm going to talk about those as well. How many of you are using .NET 8 right now? Holy crap. All of you almost. Cool. So static server render, server side rendering, that was hard to say for some reason. So what is happening is that the browser is doing a request to the server. The server is then rendering the state or the HTML, and we're going to get the response back to the DOM like that. This is, as the name implies, static. If I click the button, nothing is going to happen. This is kind of like MVC or web forms, if you will. You kind of need to do some extra things to get it to become interactive. You can use forms inside of this as well. So when it comes to streaming server-side rendering, it's only an attribute saying it's streaming equals true. So what happens is that the browser is doing a request. We are rendering the things that we can. So in this case, the H1. Then we go back and get some data from the database, for example. But while we're doing that, we can send a response saying, you know what? this is what I have so far. Update that. And then when the data is done, we can get another response, or actually it's the same response going over to the browser. So by using just an attribute, we can get the feeling of interactive components without actually them being interactive. We also have the per component state or per component rendering, which is really, really cool. Because what we can do is that we can run the WebAssembly version of components in the browser, but also have SignalR set up so that we can update the DOM that way. So we can have both Razor components from the server and inside of the web browser. Now, there is a problem with this implementation right now, I would say, because you will get one, when you're pre-rendering the page, you will get one dependency injection version of the objects that you need. Then when you are using server, you will get one version of the objects, and you will get one version for the browser. So you're not really sharing any state. So if you're updating something in the browser, you're updating only that dependency injection object. And if you're updating the server, you're just updating that. And if your page, for some reason, doesn't contain any server rendered components, it will disconnect SignalR and destroy any dependency injection objects that you have access to. So next time you go into that server page or another, then the dependency injection is going to recreate that object. So state is a little bit tricky when you are mixing and matching like that. Then we have auto mode, which is really nice, because what's happening is that if something takes longer than, I believe it's 100 milliseconds, so if we're loading our page and loading WebAssembly is going to take longer than 100 milliseconds, it's going to connect SignalR. We're going to get all of that fast response time from running Blazor server, and then the next time we enter the page, we are going to get the WebAssembly version instead. So we don't have to wait for all of the data or the DLLs to get downloaded before we can start using the site, which is really nice. I've been playing around with this and I'm having a little bit of trouble to get the server version running. It's always faster just to start up WebAssembly. I've had some examples working and I've had some examples not working. So if you want to use auto mode, test it out. I think this is still, there are still some kinks in auto mode, I would say. What about Blazor Hybrid? Well, let's talk about WebAssembly again. So this is the WebAssembly version of Blazor. Again, it's only different where things are running. So instead of running it inside the web browser, we're running it inside of iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, or Tizen. Instead of running on the WebAssembly version, we're running inside of .NET or .NET for iOS or Android. So here's where things get really, really cool. Because the same Razor components, we can run Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly for accessing the web, or, well, SSR, I guess. We can run .NET MAUI to access iOS, Android, Mac OS, Tizen, or Windows. Or we can use a web view to also get WPF inside, running Blazor inside of WPF in Windows as well. So suddenly, knowing how to use Blazor makes it possible to access all of these platforms with the same code base. This running Blazor, they always said that no more JavaScript. We don't have to use JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever it may be. And I would say this might be a little bit of a myth. It depends on where you're coming from. I came from MVC. I basically didn't have to write any JavaScript. But coming to Blazor, I've built some tools, I've built some components, I've built some Bluetooth communication libraries, and all of those are written mostly in JavaScript. So for me, moving to Blazor actually meant writing more JavaScript. So it depends on where you're coming from. And back in the day of .NET 5 or .NET 3, you had to write some JavaScript, for example, to change the page title. That is luckily not the case anymore. But in some cases, we need to go and talk to JavaScript to be able to run certain things inside of Blazor. Luckily, the community is quite large, so we don't always have to resort to writing the scripts ourselves, which is really nice. The really cool thing is, though, that it is possible to run JavaScript. So if we have that amazing JavaScript component that we just can't live without, we can use it, which is really nice as well. Now, I wouldn't recommend mixing and matching JavaScript and Blazor. I would rather prefer doing one or the other, but I think it's kind of nice that it's possible. In 2002, .NET came out, and I said, oh, we are going to run Visual Basic or Visual Basic.NET, because we have been running Visual Basic before, and I grew up on Basic basically. And my colleague said, no, we're not going to do that. We are going to use C#. And I'm like, what? Do I have to learn C? Because I didn't know anything about C# back then. I mean, I want to use Visual Basic. Let's do Visual Basic. And he said, no, we are going to learn C#. We're going to adopt C#, and we're not going to bring over any old habits from our time in Visual Basic. And I would say the same thing goes for Blazor. I see a lot of people using Fluxor or a Blazor state, or bringing over the same way of working with React or Angular into Blazor. I'm not saying it's wrong, but in some cases, you might want to take a look at how to build things in Blazor before you bring in JavaScript components or the JavaScript way of working with components. So that is my recommendation. It is possible, this is something that not a lot of people are talking about, but it is possible to run web components inside of Blazor. So web components is a way of packaging JavaScript or client-side libraries, I should say, into a component, and we can run that inside of Blazor. The really cool thing here is also that you can package Blazor components as web components. So you can use JavaScript inside of Blazor, or JavaScript components inside of Blazor, and you can use Blazor web components inside of JavaScript or even MVC. So if we're moving from a JavaScript site, now I'm using JavaScript as a term instead of saying Angular and React, but a JavaScript site to Blazor, you could inject Blazor components inside of there, or the other way around, which is really handy. So let's talk about lessons learned. So this is a very common question that I get. Should I put the code inside a Razor or should we use code behind? So I'm a little bit curious now, since I see you on the camera here. How many are writing code inside a Razor file? Oh, just a few of you, and code behind, I'm assuming the rest of you. Okay. So when Blazor came out, the Razor files was the only real example that we were seeing. So I thought, you know what? I didn't like it, but I'm going to give it a try. And the more I tried it, the more I used it, I kind of fell in love with it, because not having to switch files back and forth is a really nice way of working, I think. And we kind of moved all the logic into a service that we inject into the page. So we kind of have it in a code behind file or another file, I should say. It's easier for testing. It's easier for not having all that code inside of the Razor page. But I think that, for example, like a button, if I click the button, I want the code that is running that button inside of the Razor file. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing either or, but I think that's a really, I would recommend, if you haven't tried running Razor files or putting the code inside of Razor files, I would recommend at least trying it. This is a very common question I get as well. So I'm just starting with Blazor. What component library should I use? And I don't know where this is coming from. I would say that the first thing that you need to do is learn Blazor. How does it work? How do you create components before you start adding components in there? Because I've seen a lot of usage of components and from people that perhaps don't know exactly how components work. And well, you're not going to get the full experience of Blazor doing it that way. Now, the first question should be, do I need a component library? What are my needs? Now, the really nice thing is that a lot of vendors have a Blazor library. Progress Teller, DevExpress, Syncfusion, Radson. I've been using Radson at my old workplace. We are using MudBlazor in my new workplace. And we're using Progress Telleric on our stream. All really nice frameworks. So far, there's always something that I don't like with the framework. And we're going to come back to how we can solve that. Now, in the old days of building components for web forms and stuff like that, it was tricky. But with Blazor, everything is a component. So we should take advantage of that and simply ask ourselves, can this component be reused? Can I simplify the usage somehow? As I mentioned, component vendors are not a bad idea. You should definitely use them if you have the need for it. But they also have the ability to support a lot of different companies. And you only need to support your company and your team. So by adding some kind of abstraction layer, it would be beneficial for you and your team. And would start. I'm going to start with showing you how to build a reusable component. So let's pop into Visual Studio for a while. So this is, let me show you the component that we're building. We are adding a to-do button here, actually, although that code is already in here. So we're building a to-do button. And instead of saying that this button is, if we're using the term from Bootstrap, is a danger button, is a BTN danger, we're saying that it's a delete button. We have an onClick method. I'm gonna show you how you can build that. And we're also building a confirm message into the platform so that we don't need to put or add those kind of dialog functions everywhere. So let's go back here. So let's start with adding a couple of parameters. I want to add a parameter for a render fragment. So render fragment is a way of adding custom HTML. So we're just going to call this child content because that is going to give us a way of adding. If we let me see how I should put this. If we put code between the to-do button tags, that is automatically going to get pushed into that parameter. Let's create another one, which is a string, which is the confirm message. And last but not least, we're going to create an event callback, which is onClick method, like that. So when we click the button, we want the onClick event callback to run. So we're going to add a method, an onClick async. This is what we are going to execute inside of our component. We are going to run onClick. Let me push that up a bit. We're going to check, do I want to run it or not? We're going to check that if we have a confirm message. So if I want to confirm whether or not I can press this button, we're simply going to call a JavaScript method. We're going to run, we're going to invoke that with an IJS object reference. And we're going to simply invoke that method. And I'm calling this to-do app mana because to-do. I really like puns. I'm sorry. So we're gonna go in. So I'm saying underscore content. So underscore content is gonna say to Blazor that we can run. We can get this script from another component. In this case, it's the component mana.component library basically. And we have the to-do button.razor.js. So if we want, should we run it? Well, it depends on what our JavaScript says. So I'm going to run the show confirm JavaScript. I'm going to send in the confirm message. And if the confirm message is null, or we can run it. So it's okay. We're going to invoke the onClick method. And the onClick is an event callback. Event callbacks is a struct, can't be null. So compared to other events in .NET, we don't have to check for null. We're simply going to close that one up. So let's take a look at the JavaScript just quickly here. This is just a function, show confirm, and it's showing the JavaScript confirm and sending in the message. Okay, great. Let's see, where did my button go? There it is. We also might want to add a couple of capture things. So we can say that we can create a parameter, and we can say that capture unmatched values. So for example, if I have a class that I want to add, or whatever it may be, disabled, for example, I can take all of those values that I don't have parameters for and simply put them into my new component. And I will show you how you implement that in just a second. So I'm going to say that this is a dictionary with strings and objects. And I'm going to call it additional attributes. Great. Now, instead of writing all of this documentation saying that, well, for a save button, I want to use a success button, for example, or a primary button. And for all the delete buttons, I want to use a danger, for example. We want to use a more specialized language for our team. So we're going to add a parameter. In this case, I want to add it to do button type enum. I'm just going to say that button type is, or I'm going to set that to get or set. And then I'm going to create the enum. And the enum is, I need to see the code. I have a camera in front of me. So they typically in a button, I'm thinking that we need add, we need console, we need delete, and edit and save. The cancel, the delete might be both danger buttons. Doesn't really matter. So let's add that as well. So we're going to add a string. It's going to check the button class, or it's called button class, and it's going to return the class that we want, the CSS class that we want to use. So we're going to switch on button type. If it is an add, we want to return BTN and BTN primary. For a cancel, we want to return BTN or BTN danger. For a delete, we want to add as well a danger button. This makes it possible. Two things makes this great, I think. One of them is that if we want to change this later on, it's only one place. But for me, it's really all about less cognitive load. I don't have to think about, should the delete button be danger button or not? Doesn't matter. Since I'm saying it's a delete button, the team has already decided what to use. So let's finish with an edit button and the save button, like so. And then we're going to have a primary button. If it's not set, we're just going to say it's a primary button. Clean this up. There we go. What's up with the indentation? There we go. Then it's time to actually implement the button. In this case, we're going to use an ordinary button. We can add the type button. We add the button class that we added. On click, we want to run our on click method. We're going to add attributes, and this is where you put all of the unmatched attributes I just talked about. I'm just going to add additional attributes there. And then we're going to display the child content as the button text, or whatever it may be. So if we go back to this, everything is implemented here. So the nice thing here is that if we add a confirm message, we don't have to, this is the implementation of the delete item. We don't have to add a JS runtime and invoke that. We don't need to add this confirm call. The only thing we need to keep here is only the code that I need to run to delete an item. I don't have to think about how to implement a message box. I don't have to think about how to implement or what is right for my team. So this kind of way of working, I think, is a really nice way of removing pain points as a developer. Let's see, let's pop back to the presentation here. There we go. So I have a couple of ideas that we have implemented in our button class. We have whether or not a form is valid or not. So disable the button if the form isn't valid, for example. Automatic confirm messages, that like the one we just built. We can disable the button while it's executing, so we avoid people double clicking, for example, or show a loading spinner while it's working. We can add permission handling. So if we want to, perhaps we don't want to show the button if you don't have permission, or we just want to have it disabled and show a message that, hey, you know what, you don't have permission. We can get all of that functionality all through our website. And for styling, like the one we talked about. So my advice here is that you should build reusable components and build helper components like the one I just showed you. I mean, it doesn't have to be a reusable component, like we don't have to build a button component. We can use Radsen or Progress Tolerate or whatever it may be, but abstract it away. Get the default values in there so you don't have to write the same thing over and over again. What about does companies use Blazor? Well, I saw that. I don't know if you are working on hobby projects or your companies are running Blazor, but there was a lot of hands in the audience here. And the short answer is yes, they are. A lot of companies are using Blazor. Really big Swedish companies, like companies that you have heard of. I can't mention the names, sadly. I'm talking like the top 10 big companies, that kind of company. I have a lot of friends that are working at consultants firms, and they have a lot of customers that are running Blazor as well. And I get this question a lot as well. So why isn't Microsoft running Blazor? Why isn't Teams running Blazor, for example? Well, when Teams were when they started to rewrite Teams, Blazor was not in, or actually Maui was not in a state where it could host Blazor that way. But .NET Aspire, which came out just recently, or I think it's still in beta, or maybe it's out now. I don't know. But the portal is done in Blazor. So one of the things that the latest things from Microsoft is running Blazor, which is good news. Let's talk about some server-specific things or learnings. Well, we had an incident with our server. Actually, our SQL server was a little bit tired one day. And we didn't have a refresh button in the UI. So people started pressing F5 like crazy. And what's happening with Blazor server is that it's going to disconnect the SignalR connection. It's going to establish a new one, keeping the old one with its state and all of that. on the server for, I think the default is 3 minutes. And well, it's going to consume a lot of memory that way. So my recommendation here is add a refresh button where it makes sense so that people can refresh and get new data without pressing F5. And that goes for WebAssembly as well, because if we press F5, WebAssembly is going to reload and we're going to get that initial load time again. And don't mix non-Blazor and Blazor pages, because that is something we ran into as well. We had MVC pages and we have Blazor pages. And as soon as you go to a non-Blazor page, it's going to disconnect, keep the state on the server, and well, we're going to run into the same issues. We also got some user feedback, which was kind of nice because it went from why isn't my data showing up to nothing. Actually, it went from nothing happened. So I pressed a button, nothing happened. Because in the MVC world or the web pages world, the whole page reloaded. So you saw that the page reloaded. Something happened. But with Blazor, nothing is going to reload. We're going to execute some things. If we don't update the UI, the user's not going to know that something happened. So it went from nothing happened to, why isn't my UI updating automatically? We had to do a lot of things, moving more interactivity to our site, which was really fun to see. So make sure you notify the user so that you show that, you know what, this is saved, customer is saved, or whatever it may be. For us, the development speed of Blazor, and we talked about in the beginning, the React developer that also was more efficient using Blazor, I would say that for our team, it was crucial that we switched to Blazor, because we found that moving an MVC controller to Blazor was actually faster than to fix an issue in the MVC controller. We had such a speed that we were only 6 developers in our team, and we did the same thing. There was a lot of companies in Sweden doing the same backend move at that point in time. We were 6 developers, and we beat the companies that were 10 times more developers. And I would say that, I'm not saying that Blazor is going to make you more efficient than Angular or React, because if you know those frameworks, you're probably going to be efficient at them. But for our team, the development speed was just out of this world. So is Blazor server slow? This is also a very common question. And we talked about how it works. It sends WebSocket calls. And we've been running this in production since 2019. We have had slow UIs. I'm not going to argue with that. But in all of those cases, it's all about this SQL Server in this case. Blazor server has never been an issue. So I would say it depends. Is it going to be slower than MVC or web forms? No, definitely not. It's going to be faster. Is it going to be slower than Angular or React? Maybe, because we are doing a request to the server. Now, granted, since it knows the state, it's only going to push over the changes in the UI, while Angular or React would get the whole data pushed over and then do that distinction in the on the client. So maybe. I think it depends. There's also some areas where Blazor server is the wrong choice. I talked to a couple of developers at a conference, and they said, well, we want to use Blazor server. That much we know. And we have two requirements. It has to work offline, and it has to handle millions of users at the same time. And these are the two things that Blazor server is bad at. Well, it's not bad at handling a lot of connections, but you have to have a, well, larger server for handling that, since all the state is on the server. And there's no offline support at all, since we need to have a concurrent signal or connection. What about WebAssembly? Well, the most common question is footprint. I would argue that the question is really about load time. People have focused a lot about the megabytes when we're talking about Blazor WebAssembly, but it's actually about the load time. Now, I did a couple of comparisons. So this is not I would say that this comparison is not 100% okay to do, but it's also kind of like we need to talk about the megabytes. So Facebook has 16 megabytes of JavaScript downloaded. 16 megabytes. Pinterest has 6 megabytes. YouTube have 4. Twitter have 3. Apple has Stack Overflow has 1.5. Apple has 1.25. And the Blazor, just a basic Blazor demo, I think this data is actually a little bit old. I think it's under 1 megabyte now. So it's not about the megabytes, really. It's more about the loading time, because WebAssembly can feel a little bit sluggish when you download it, but it's not about it's not about the megabytes, really. So what can we do? Well, we can show a progress bar, and the default templates in I believe it was already in .NET 7, definitely in .NET 8, has an built-in progress bar. We can use server pre-render. And if we start a .NET 8 project and we're using the web app and we select global WebAssembly, we get that pre-render for free. We can use Junichi's Sakamoto's is a fellow MVP. He has a pre-render that is going to pre-render WebAssembly at publish time. So you can get a little bit of data in there. That's obviously not going to be updated if you have database calls and stuff like that, but it's a way to get data to the users a little bit faster. You can ahead of time compile. Now, I mentioned that the footprint is going to get larger. It's going to be more megabytes to download, but it's going to load faster. So that would be the trade-off. If you have users that have really bad connection, then ahead of time compile is not going to solve that problem. And for most applications, you don't need ahead of time compiled either, but that's an option. Or you can use the new auto mode. So it's going to download it while WebAssembly is downloading. You can run Blazor server. So I want to show you a project that I've built. This is one of my project that I love to show off. I don't know how it is in Norway, but in Sweden, the ZX Spectrum was really, really big in the 80s. Did any one of you have a ZX Spectrum? Oh, one. Awesome. So I had a ZX Spectrum. This was my first computer. And I remember sitting down, writing 10, print Jimmy, 20, go to 10, because that was, I was so happy because that was my code. I got the computer to run things. And when I became a developer, I thought, wouldn't it be kind of cool to be able to build an emulator? So this is my ZX Spectrum emulator built in C# running on Blazor WebAssembly ahead of time compiled. If I reload the page, you'll see that the load is quite fast. Granted, it's already in the cache, but the load time is not really a problem here. So if I start this, I'm going to start Manic Miner. I really hope that the sound didn't come through the HDMI channel. If it did, I'm sorry. But it actually has sound as well. And it's doing that using JavaScript interrupts. So this is a fully working emulator that you can play. zxbox.com if you want to try it yourself. I did build this emulator using, I built it for Xbox. That's why it's called ZXbox. So this is open source. You can check it out and see how it's built. Now I want to jump back to Visual Studio for a moment. Actually, I want to jump back to the web browser real quick first. So I built a Visual Studio extension called the Blossom extension. Is anyone seen this? Anyone using it? No? Okay, so hopefully I have a couple of more users. So what it does is that it helps with some of the pain points when it comes to developing Blazor applications. So for example, creating a new isolated JavaScript, you would press Shift F2 or something like that. You would type the name of the Razor file. You would normally forget to change the file extension and create a CS class first. Then you would curse a little bit, you would delete it, and you would do it all over again. And you need to spell the file correctly. And then you have a isolated CSS or JavaScript file. Same thing goes for the code behind or stuff like that. We can move namespaces to import to the closest imports file. We can extract to a component, so we can select a little bit of code and extract that to a new component. We can find where we're using components, and we can also move some code to a code behind, actually move a code behind to the Razor file, which is something that it's built into Visual Studio to do the other way around, to move Razor file to a code behind, but not the other way around. You can also find all the different routes and create, this is a little bit of a beta feature, but you can create at least a stub of code for a B-unit test. So I want to show you just a couple of how that would, let me see, let me remove this one. There we go. So let's say that I want to create a isolated CSS. Well, I can right click on the counter.razor and simply create an isolated CSS. And boom, we got that one there. If I want to do the same thing for an isolated JavaScript, I can do that, and we got that one there as well. Let's say that I haven't tested this for a while, so let's see if this works. I want to move this code to a I don't even see that option. Is it actually here? Apparently, this is the worst demo ever because I can't see that option. But I can create a code behind at least, so that's good. I have let me see here, extensions, Blossom, and show Blazor routes. It popped up on my other screen here. So here's all the routes inside of this application. And if I click the to-do item here, for example, or to-do list, it will take me to that position in the code. So hopefully this helps in some way. And I would love if you have any feature that you would love to see. I would be happy to implement them. I can just show you the B unit test. So in this case, I can create as a Razor syntax or as a C# syntax. So let's create one in Razor syntax. I will just paste it in right here, and it will simply create the code that we need to get that test or that component tested. It will not create an act or create a button, but if it had some parameters, it would show up here as well.